Great. Everyone can hear me well? Okay. Good morning, everyone. We're at the final day of the conference. And first of all, I would like to sincerely thank Arctic Frontiers for allowing us to host this side event. We're very excited about this side event here. So we have a 90 minutes time slot for us. The way that we're going to do this today is I will give a little bit of a opening scope of why we're actually having this side event. And then we have 4 very interesting speakers lined up who will then also join me on the stage afterwards when we have a little panel discussion. We like to have a lot of interaction, or at least we like to present the opportunity to everyone to come in with the questions they might have, especially as this is a topic which is not very known to people, I think. It's very much appreciated to just either post questions online in the app from Arctic Frontiers. I'm also co-leading this event together with many thanks to Raul Primiserio, professor at the Arctic University here in Tromsø. While I'm on the stage, Raul is burning calories probably this morning. He will be the one who has a microphone that can go around the room to capture questions. So if you want to have a voice, then for sure get the attention from Raul, and in Italian style, he will come to you as soon as possible. We're also having a live stream to this event, for which we have sent out a link as well, so people can actually capture questions as well, even if they're not in the room here. So thanks to the volunteer here, who will be having a very busy time, hopefully, monitoring those 2 platforms as well. So that having said, this is not supposed to be a formal event, not a formal structure. We just aim to be providing inspiration and understanding here today. Okay. So sometimes things are black and white, or maybe they are not. This is maybe a stupid question, maybe it's an ambitious question, I don't know. This is what we will try to find out today. Why we're having this side event, really, basically, is like I said, we're co-leading the session here from the Norwegian Polar Institute, as well with UIT. And at the Norwegian Polar Institute, we are leading an international project which is running in the Arctic Council, specifically in the working groups from PAIM and CAF. And the university is running its own project as well. So in that sense, it's very nice to have a collision between a more research-heavy project at the university and a more governance-heavy project, which is the one running in the Arctic Council. At the same time, we're also having 2 frameworks which are now being introduced to each other. It's kind of a new framework that has got an increasing attention the last years, nature-based solutions, especially in 2020 when it was adapted formally and defined by the United Nations Environmental Programme. And at the same time, and I'm sure you all have the same feeling, we cannot escape several words when we're at this kind of conference, these words being a little bit shorter than on the text here. So we have the 30 by 30. I mean, everyone has heard this probably too many times, this conference. And at the same time, everyone is also very excited about the new High Seas Treaty, which is also a much nicer abbreviation than that beast on the slide here. So what's in the name? I mean, these are all terms and you have to get used to them. And for many people, there may be completely new terminology here. So the easy ones, let's start with those because they're shorter definitions. What is area-based management? Basically to manage activities within a defined area, mainly with the goal to achieve biodiversity and sustainability objectives. That's nice and clean, nice and easy to work with. Just a little expansion to that is how do we do that? We need tools for that, we need measures for that, and that's why we call them area-based management tools. And I'm just giving you the abbreviations here as well, should they slip out today in the discussions. So this is an area-based management tool. It's basically a measure that enables how we do area-based management. And for example, there are several abbreviations you will hear coming into that. So marine protected area is probably something everyone has heard of at some point. So marine protected area is one of those area-based measurement tools. There are many more abbreviations. There's OECMs, there's IPCAs, there's EPSI. It's not really an ABMT, but there's many, many more tools also in the making to actually execute on area-based management. Okay, nature-based solution, what the hell is this? I tried to highlight in blue the most interesting parts of it, and I almost ended up highlighting the entire thing, because it's very, very complex, at least in my view. It's more than a mouthful of what it tries to be, I would say. So these are, but there's some synonyms there. There's some synologies there between area-based management, which tries to enable biodiversity and sustainability. We see those same words popping up here as well, to protect and conserve, but also restore and sustainable use and manage. At the same time, it wants to address social, economical, and environmental challenges, and it wants to provide human well-being, ecosystem services, resilience, and biodiversity benefits. So, I mean, come on. That is really, really ambitious, and this is also really complex, I would say. It's like someone who doesn't understand what each of those words would entail. It's like, I'm just throwing everything at it. It's more like a PR stunt, or maybe it's not. And that's why it kind of captured my attention. I said, well, we have now kind of a nature-based solution framework, which is more like a conceptual, philosophical framework. And then we have a very actionable framework, which is area-based management, which is spatial governance. So like I said, we have these two projects. Recently, in the Arctic Council, the working groups PAIM and CAF, so Protection of the Arctic Marine Environment and the Conservation of Arctic Flora and Fauna, have kickstarted last August a 4-year project to kind of live true to what they wrote in 2015. Okay, let's go for a pan-Arctic network of conservation measures. So 10 years later, we're kicking this off, and at the same time, we also have research evolving more and more and more. So we have the RESOLVE project at the UIT, which is about nature-based solutions for sustainable use of high north marine biodiversity and services, ecosystem services. Really quickly, really quickly, but so that you understand why the projects are there. The project we run at the Norwegian Polar Institute, together with the Kingdom of Denmark. WWF is also involved in there, and Canada. So we want to create this pan-Arctic network of areas of high conservation priority. But we also want to support planning and development of a climate resilient network. And again, this is the first link with nature-based solutions, because nature-based solutions really try to provide solutions against climate impacts, for example. As you can see, there's many acronyms here. Measures that we are aware of, that we know are kind of operable, is MPAs, OECMs, and also very important for Arctic Council and for the Arctic, is because there's actual people living in there. So the Arctic peoples, they also have their way of identifying and managing areas of interest. So these are the indigenous protected conserved areas. We know that we need to be climate resilient. This is the Arctic. It's the fastest changing place in the world when it comes to the climate environment. So also very important, the Arctic Council is very keen on doing ecosystem-based management. So to have a more holistic view, not single species management, not sectoral management, but ecosystem-based management, which is again one of those things that link up to nature-based solutions. I hope I got this right. I think the RESOLVE project is about these things. I'm pretty sure it is, though. So this is very different. This is not about spatial governance. You can feel these are research-driven questions and hypotheses and aims. It's a very different way, but still it has these linkages which could really help, for example, the Arctic Council project. So, for example, one of those things is to think about trade-offs and synergies with human well-being. That's the nature-based solution kind of core principle, if I can call it like that, which is very important for the Arctic Council executing on spatial planning, because we are inclusive to the indigenous peoples. They need to have that seat at the table, and we need to think of what is good for them as well. And then it's also about transformative change to see how nature-based solutions can contribute to climate mitigation and dynamic MPA solutions. So I hope you kind of feel the linkages between those two projects, several similar aims, but maybe coming from different frameworks, more from a governance Arctic Council perspective and one from a very science-driven way. So this is what we will talk about today. I wanted to put it up there because it needs to be said, WWF has in the last 10 years suggested one solution for a Pan-Arctic network of area-based measure tools, being MPAs, OCMs, whatever it is. And this is, I think, a very nice holistic picture that depicts, for me at least, what nature-based solutions would be about. And so there's these several elements in there which make it, for me, a holistic framework. Because it puts human health and well-being and biodiversity side by side. It puts very central societal challenges. It has ecosystem-based management in there. So there's a lot of ticking boxes that would be very good for the way we do things in PAIM and CAF with spatial planning, to take elements from this and see if we can put them in the more conventional way of how we do area-based management today. So that's the big question. Again, like I said, might be a very naive question, might be a very interesting question. In any case, I like that we can have a side event that is interactive, as I said. So we also have prepared a little interactive poll for the audience here in the room, as well as for the audience that's actually watching this as a live stream. So then we will switch to the Mentimeter. And at the same time, please remember to take your phones, but also keep them on quiet mode. That would be very nice. And I hope that this works for everyone, but otherwise you just give a little heads up, for example.
It says waiting for presenter. Yeah.
Good. Then I obviously need to drink coffee. So I'm trying to run this from my phone, so I hope by now you can enter the poll on your phone.
Okay. Waiting for presenter.
Does this change?
Something's happening.
Okay, that's great. Also on your phone, I hope you can see this. That's great. So let's get to know each other. Like I said, we have esteemed persons here in the room, and we also have, we actually have people watching from the cloud as well, so that's great. I need to give this a bit of time because there might be a delay in the answering and the technology. Also, at the same time, you can see at the bottom of your screens, you have the possibility to also ask a question or something. Should there be something specific at this stage of the Mentimeter, you can just pop in there and put a question there, for example. Okay, I give it 3 more Mississippis. Okay. The first challenging question. Especially if you have a dual identity. We also try to be very respectful these days, and also to point out, if you prefer not to answer this one, still answer, but prefer not to answer, for example. So that you can actually continue in the poll and answer other questions, for example. So we have mostly researchers, academia in the room or online, that's hard to say here. Some NGOs, that's also great to have. Very interesting how the media and communications people identify themselves. I think it's great that we have not just researchers here. That is amazing. And a philanthropist is also there, 2 of them actually. Private sector and some government. That's great. I think that's a very nice mix. So, who are you? I'm also very happy to see that there's early career people here and students. That's really nice. At the same time, you have directors having an interest. That's great. So for example, if you are other, because I try to capture every possibility there is. If you are, for example, the other person, it would be very nice, for example, if you write in the comment box how you identify if you don't fit in any of those boxes. Okay. Yes. Yeah, you can identify yourself these days as anything you want, so there you go. I don't see anything moving anymore, so who is on the spectrum here? And where are you on that spectrum? So you get a 1 to 5 scoring. 1 for you don't think you're on the spectrum, to on a daily basis being.
Where's policy and where's science? Yeah, exactly.
Sorry?
What's the one? Science on the left or?
Oh, no. So just to clarify, this is not to say if you're on the science side of the spectrum or on the policy side. It's more how are you on a daily basis involved with the information that goes from science to policy, or the information that needs to be requested for policy.
Interface.
Yeah, on the interface, but not if you're science or policy. That is not what this question is. So there's no newbies in the room. That's interesting. And there's also some hardcore spectrum people here as well. That is very nice, because when we have a discussion here, we are, of course, and I think each and one of us has said it, none of us is an expert, although I would say they are experts, but none of us can be an expert. So it's very nice to get the perspectives from anyone who is here and to take the opportunity to ask those questions and get a dialogue going on this. Okay. So, just to ask also those that are in the room and in the cloud for their opinion, I have prepared just a few more questions. So how familiar are you actually when you hear nature-based solutions? Someone is an expert. That's great and scary at the same time.
It's an Igor, it's anonymous, right?
Yeah. Sadly, yes. No, that's actually a higher average that I would be expecting. Because I would put myself also there, which is why this is kind of a daunting task to moderate this panel today. I'll give it 5 more seconds. Okay. So what comes to mind? Just one keyword, if you can. If you can't, then don't force your brain this early in the morning, but if you can, just nice to capture what people associate instinctively when they hear nature-based solutions. Oh, that's really clear. lot of different things there. So although maybe expectedly sustainable and sustainability are coming out as the main words there, there's a lot of interesting words there like fuzzy and escapism, and at the same time the opposite, the future. Cooperation is also nice to see that popping up. Okay, this is going too fast for me. Yeah, integrated assessments is there, integrated management, marine protected areas is there, self-regulating, conflicts, holistic. So it's nice to see some of the words that I also associate popping up here, but it's also very nice to see mimetic, for example, conflict is there. Greenwashing is also. Yeah. Idealistic, yeah, maybe that's also what we figure out today. Okay, that's great. Oh. Okay. So who knows about area-based management? So this is pretty much the same score as we had for nature-based solutions. So people are familiar with this, maybe more than on a daily basis, so that's a pretty impressive show up of people then. It's not just people that have no clue what this is about, which is what I was a few months ago. Okay, let's go for the last question. So also here, little word clouds. What comes to your mind if you think about area-based management? It's nice to know that there's people that are not too lazy and actually type out marine protected areas. I would definitely just type MPA. Ranger patrols, yeah. Fisheries, multiple use, also here conflict again. Scale, also very important, of course. Wildfire management. Marine protected areas, BB&J, wildlife parks. So although I'm pretty good with acronyms, I can see this, or I saw at least this CZM acronym there, which I have no clue what it means. So if you could leave that in. Could be, yeah. I'm not gonna remember that. If you could put that in the comment, I would be so appreciated. Good on paper, yeah. Maybe all of this is good on paper. That's also part of the discussion that I would like to have today. Yeah, that I know. I've heard that. Okay, this is, I give it 5 more seconds, so type fast. All right. Last question. And we will be repeating this question, by the way, at the very end of the side event, to see if we actually had an influence on your opinion right now, in whatever capacity you are sitting here or are watching. It will be very interesting to see how this number shifts or doesn't shift, and in which direction it shifts. There's a lot of optimism in the room.
It's more than just coffee.
What would have been very interesting is to see a bipolar frequency here. Okay, 10 more seconds, and then we wrap up this Mentimeter. So while the last 10 seconds are ticking, so this is basically my intro to the session. We will repeat the last 3 questions here at the very end to see how the side event might have influenced you in which direction. The more interesting part will be that we have now 4 experts, or at least very intelligent people, and please don't stress when I say that, I sincerely mean that, very, very nice speakers lined up. So we have 4 speakers lined up. We will start with Anna Woodhead from the Stockholm Resilience Center. Following will be Martin Lindgren from DTU Aqua from Denmark. So also very sincere thanks for traveling here and joining the session. Then we move on to our local guy, Bas Klerk from the university, wrapping it up with the very well-known and esteemed Rolf Rödven from the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program. Okay, so first speaker of this side event, Anna Woodhead from Stockholm Resilience Center. Thank you so much.
Where's the clicker? I do, thank you. Hello, good. I don't know if it's a speaker's dream to know more about your audience before you start or not. But yeah, so thank you, Igor. My name is Anna Woodhead. As you said, I'm a researcher at the Stockholm Resilience Centre. I'm part of the Resolve team in this, but I was also tasked a little bit with maybe giving some overview of some of the concepts at play here. So Igor, you've also covered a little bit of that. So some of it may be repetition, but what I want to do is maybe draw out some of those interesting components, and also to bring in the transformation element that Resolve is hoping to address. So let's get started. Okay, nature-based solutions. As Igor said, there's been a lot of different ideas and concepts about nature-based solutions and different definitions, but then at one point the UN kind of tried to establish a much clearer definition. Igor, you've saved at least a minute of my talk in trying to read this out, but I still want to emphasize, because my highlighting was actually slightly different from yours. And so I think the key take-homes for me is that nature-based solutions, and I can read down there as well, we're talking here about actions. You know, these are active interventions, and then we have the full list of different ecosystems, and we're engaging with them. But I think the key thing here is around simultaneously providing for human well-being, ecosystem services, resilience, and biodiversity benefits. And I've had some really great chats here acknowledging the team at DTU and Louise, because I think this is one of the key questions. It's can an intervention, or an action, be considered a nature-based solution if it doesn't provide for these benefits for both people and nature? And is this idea of simultaneous benefits really key to how we define nature-based solutions? Yes. Oh, okay. So I can either read or block. There we go. But yeah, and I think this is quite often what we think about. I noticed someone put up reed beds with nature-based solutions, but we often think of this kind of restoration. This is a eelgrass restoration project in southern Sweden. And so this is quite often what we think about with nature-based solutions. But as Igor said, and Raoul has often said, we can also think about protected areas in that. So this brings us to then the linkage in the next concept as area-based management tools. And again, Igor stolen my thunder a tiny bit. But here we can think of these as geographically defined areas. This is very hard. There we go. In which human activities are regulated for one or more purposes. And here again, we have these ideas of multiple benefits, but here we sort of emphasize that it can be sustainable biodiversity conservation, sustainable resource use, or both. So there's an element here that there isn't necessarily a need to have human benefits when thinking about area-based management tools. It's more about managing those activities within the area. The other thing that I think is quite interesting about area-based management tools, although we've heard a lot about marine protected areas, is that there are many other different types. So we can have sector-specific area-based management tools when we think about fisheries or shipping or deep-sea mining, but then we have the cross-sectoral ones, and then this is then, I think, when we're talking more about area-based conservation and the tools within that, like MPAs, but also marine spatial planning, which hasn't really come up in any of the conversations so far on area-based management tools, and is another whole body of research that we could think about integrating better into this. What I think is really cool, though, to consider as well, we're going to hear from Bas about the High Seas Treaty and area-based management tools in this context, is that predating the ratification of the treaty, there were already 47 different regional and international legislative tools where we identified area-based management tools. So although the term still doesn't have a single formal definition, it was already very well established in the literature prior to BBNJ. And I think when you think about it, this makes sense because, you know, we've been drawing lines on the map and saying, don't do that there for as long as we've been thinking about conservation. And yet we still have lots of challenges around different types of area-based management. So everyone here, sorry, I get nervous, then I run out of breath, and then halfway through the talk, it's like, okay, so that's my moment. But yeah, as many of us know, there are lots of issues here still around area-based management tools, predominantly around implementation and effectiveness, but also monitoring of outcomes. Like, we don't have any data or that much data looking at the social and economic outcomes of area-based management tools, regardless of the type of area-based management tool. And the reporting on ecological and biodiversity outcomes are also quite patchy. You can check out this paper that was linked to some of the Resolve team that just came out. But then if we want to think about these outcomes, for example, through the Sustainable Development Goals, then this paper that came out last month highlights that actually when we look at marine protected areas, and here you do need to see, can have both positive, negative, and mixed effects, i.e. simultaneously, on all of the Sustainable Development Goals, depending on context, but also process. They have a secondary conclusion here about overstating effects and the reliance on secondary data. But here I really want to highlight that for these area-based management tools for which we have potentially the most information, the outcomes that they deliver are hugely context dependent. Third concept of the day, transformation. So I'm not going to go hugely into this, but I think transformation, and particularly in the context of sustainability transformations, we're talking about fundamental shifts in human and environmental interactions and feedbacks. So we can look at transformation, that has changed, right? I imagine that, there we go, in different ways. So my colleague Juan here led some work looking at transformation retrospectively, and this grounds us a little bit more in this Arctic context. So this was some work that Juan and colleagues led for the Arctic Resilience Report. And here they looked through the social, economic, environmental, and ecological histories of 40 communities in the Arctic. And by looking at changes or non-changes in livelihoods, i.e. a livelihood that hasn't changed, they were able to identify communities that had undergone a transformation, had either remained resilient or lost resilience. We don't live in a static world, though, and I think this is where it gets quite interesting thinking about transformations, is how do you identify a transformation as it's happening? So this research from Galicia was really interesting, where they identified different interventions within small-scale fisheries that could be described as having transformative potential. So specifically here, they looked at an area that the local fishers had identified as being important for protection, or like significantly important. So they engaged the researchers, and there was a process of co-management that followed. The thing that was super interesting, though, I thought about this paper, because I think we don't often say no enough in science, but they sort of like, we've identified these really cool interventions, they could bring about transformation, but we can't actually say if something has transformed. And I think here the paper was really interesting because they highlight the sheer social and ecological complexity of small-scale fisheries in this case, and also the fact that many drivers of change were happening at that moment. And I think this is really relevant in the Arctic, that we know is changing faster than anywhere else in the world. So, how am I going to fix this in a year? That is how long I have to connect this. So our plan within Resolve is to really not think about transformation in general, but actually thinking about specific transformations towards desirable futures. So actually, where is it that we want to be going in terms of like a future that is both resilient for communities, or like provides for resilient communities and ecosystems? And the work that I'll be doing then in that is looking at different participatory visions or scenarios about the futures that we want for the Arctic, and whether area-based management tools, as an example of nature-based solutions, can bring us towards that. So, some final take-homes, and here I really kind of wanted to take out the jargon a little bit, but of course it's very jargon still, and then also by choosing to take out the jargon, I'm also giving it like my interpretation much more, so I think other people could do this very differently. But the main thing I want to say is, like, I suppose, if we want to talk about actions that benefit people and nature, then sure, we can talk about nature-based solutions. There are other frameworks, but that is essentially the core of that concept that we're drawing on. If we want to talk about drawing lines on a map and managing what happens in those areas, then yes, area-based management tools is the mechanism through which we can do that. And if you want to talk about moving towards desirable futures, then we can draw on the transformative literature within that. But I think across all three bodies of work, the main take-homes, and this is really quite obvious, but it's kind of like the main things we need to think about actually are process and not outputs. We need to be thinking about the context specificity and not how universal. This isn't a magic silver bullet. And we also need to be thinking about meaningful participation as opposed to designation. So I think, can nature-based solutions present a turn of the tide for area-based management in the Arctic? To be honest, I really don't know. And I think the interpretation that I'd like to bring to the panel, I haven't worked in the Arctic before, but what I'm hearing more from the last few days is that, you know, the Arctic is an incredibly diverse place with incredibly different sort of worldviews, cultures, different forms of knowledge systems. And so does importing another concept that kind of dichotomizes people and nature really help us here? Or should there actually be more like place-based understandings of these sort of benefits to people and nature that can be drawn on? So my question is sort of maybe turned a little bit towards that, but I would really look forward to discussing later. And with that, thank you. No northern lights, Tromsø. But anyway, here's, here's the moon.
Thank you, Anna. We take one question for Anna from the audience, and then we need to move on, unfortunately, to make it for the panel debate. Please.
Yes. I am Sara Lilja from Finland, and I have been developing nature-based solutions in Ministry of Forestry and Agriculture. I'm not anymore working there, but to developing resilience and climate change adaptation, that tool is great. Yeah. My question is, because transformation is so big issue, have you utilized art-science interaction? No. I have two of my photographs, which are by the sea from Lofoten, and I recommend to use art-science interaction.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a really good point. I think we haven't started the data collection for this part. I am on another project that is using art-science methods across the other mission lighthouses in the EU. So I'm hoping to maybe bring a little bit of that thinking. But actually the route that we've sort of chosen to take maybe is more of a synthesis of existing participatory visions. And I think there it would be really interesting to see which methods are used to elicit different types of visions, because then we get a much more sort of not Pan-Arctic, and actually Resolve is mainly focusing on East and Western Greenland, Iceland and the Barents Sea, so that's where we'll be focusing. But yeah, I really hope we do get some art-space methods that come up, and if we don't, then I'd really like to highlight that as a gap, so thank you.
Thank you very much. Anna, you might have guessed, thanks. Yes, so you might have guessed Anna Wodet is one of the main engines of Resolve, as you might.
That was great. So now we will move on to Martin Lindgren from DTU Aqua, who's gonna probably blow us away with some nice lights and signs.
Yeah, thank you.
Cheers, Martin.
I'm just gonna move this a little bit further away so that I don't feel squeezed in front of the screen. I hope you can hear me okay. So thanks a lot for this opportunity to talk to you guys. And for some of you that attended the session on Tuesday, some of the slides will be a bit of a repetition. But I will try to put now this more in the context of nature-based solutions and really ask ourselves to what extent we can use marine protected areas, especially in the context of marine spatial planning for biodiversity especially, as a tool for sustainable use. And in that respect, I will draw from a project called Be Useful, which is finishing up, but also relating to the Resolve project, which is going to be sort of a spin-off or taking this work further with a particular focus on the Arctic. So without further ado, I'd like to just simply share my enormous fascination for life under the sea, or in the sea actually. And not only in lush, warm, tropical waters such as the Red Sea, but also in our colder waters of the north. I'm sure that many of you share this fascination, and surely my sons do this. So I think that reflects that biodiversity has an intrinsic value which is worth protecting beyond sort of the services and functions that it provides. And I think that's important to bear in mention. It has a value of itself for being protected. Unfortunately, this biodiversity on Earth is currently threatened by a range of human actions, and of course you know most of the usual suspects: fishing, especially when it comes to marine ecosystems, habitat destruction, especially on our coastlines with coastal development and coastal infrastructure. Pollution, we heard, is very important, especially in an Arctic context. But last but very not least, climate change, which is recently being identified as being perhaps the most influential driver of biodiversity loss, especially more long-term into the coming decades, up until 2100. So this changes, a cocktail of these changes or pressures, they're really increasing the risk of us losing species, both locally but also globally, and both on land and in the sea. And the unfortunate thing that we are not really doing very well to tackle this crisis. And as you can see from our poor fulfillment of our previous policy targets that were supposed to be reached some 5 years ago, 2020. So this is the assessment of how well we were doing at that time. So as you can see, unless you're colorblind, it's red. So we're not doing very well. So that's why there have been new increasing policy or updated policies on this, including, of course, the Kunming protocol, but also the EU biodiversity strategy, which sort of echoes the same ambitions. And the ambitions is clearly really to bring biodiversity on a path to recovery by 2030, and the clock is ticking, and that in order to preserve and sustain our marine ecosystems and their services and functions and services. So the question is really, well, how can we achieve this? Is this at all possible? And in that respect, nature-based solutions can be one way of achieving these objectives. And interestingly, we've seen now Igor presenting and putting up a definition from the CBD. Here's another definition from the EU Commission, which is slightly similar, but also somewhat different, actually. And beyond that, there are other definitions around. But they sort of, in general terms, they capture the flavor of something that should be inspired and support nature and support dual uses and sort of lead to a desirable, sustainable outcome overall. But the devil is in the detail. And we're actually seeing that there's a sort of a current lack of a coherent definition and the use of terminology. So some colleagues of mine, Louise Flensborg and Christian Rieser at D2, they've been looking into what is actually NBS and how is it used or misused throughout different sort of applications worldwide. And what they come up with are some clear guidelines of what needs to be there for an action to actually be called a nature-based solutions. It has, first of all, to have a very clear objective. What is this nature-based solutions there to try to rectify? What is the aim and objective? Because in many of their review, they were presented solutions not even have an objective clearly specified. Half of the instances that they looked at. It also needs to be very tied to a policy, and of course the first two goes hand in hand. The policy usually states the objective or a broader ambition. The objectives are an articulation of that broader ambition. It needs to be embedded within a clear environmental context such that you do not completely create a natural but a completely alien solution in a place where you never used to be. And it's also the choice of material, which is quite important and often misused in this terminology. So if we now look at the range of different kind of NBS, we can really be thinking about range from more passive activities, such as marine protected areas, and that's also where area-based management tools come into play as a passive NBS, if you wish. If we move to the active restoration, that has more to do with restoring habitats that were originally there in real life, so to speak. And there could be, as we saw, an example of what you mentioned, Anna. So replanting eelgrass beds, for instance, there could be oyster reefs and these kind of things. And then we move to sort of the more, potentially a bit more fuzzy applications that are often branded as being nature-based solution, but are actually not. They entail some sort of hybrid situation where you use non-natural material. You may cut up some blades from wind turbine and fold them, or you may make fish hotels out of concrete and just dump it, or you just dump a ship somewhere and call this a nature-based solution. But it's not. So this are nature-based solutions. These are called something else. They can be called NID, yet another acronym, Nature Inclusive Designs, but they cannot be used within this context. And this is sort of one of the most recent sort of synthesis of that common understanding, but it hasn't sort of reached a broader consensus yet. So I can just say that we're all, fumbling in the dark, and we need to sort out the terminology to be able to use it properly and avoid the risk of greenwashing and down the road very ineffective solutions. So I'd like to dwell very briefly on the use of marine protected areas or area-based management as an NBS, well, reflecting then a passive restoration activity. Speaking about the alignment with policy, the EU biodiversity strategy very clearly sets out the 30 by 30 target, which I'm sure you're all aware of. And obviously, setting aside some area for protection, that is something that you just simply can't do in isolation. You have to bear in mind that there are multiple activities in the ocean space, just as there are on land. So we need to be mindful about what are the potential trade-offs and synergies among these. And the question is, how can we make improved knowledge of biodiversity and also marine ecosystems in general? How can we feed into this process, this marine spatial planning process, such that we can designate MPAs as nature-based solutions in an environment? And the ambition of the BioSol project is really try to get to the nuts and bolts of that. So how we can use data and models to try to come up with a decision support tool fit for marine spatial planning in particularly, where we can model species distribution and overall indicators of biodiversity, and we can trade that off against maps of other human activities. We can look at trade-offs and come up with some sort of prioritization of where it makes sense to put MPAs. So in a nutshell, the workflow is such that we leverage on our existing data infrastructure throughout Europe. This could be our regular monitoring of benthos and fish. We can then feed this into state-of-the-art models that can take raw data and turn it to something useful. And what it turns this data into are predictions of species distribution in space and in time. And these predictions we can then use to combine and make into useful indicators for management. And these are indicators of biodiversity, so as species richness, functional richness, evenness, and so on. Multiple indicators are needed to describe the multiple facets of biodiversity. So these indicators are then indicators that can have an operational use to advise management. And I like to say and emphasize that these indicators are fitting onto a formal framework called essential biodiversity variables, such that they're rooted in that framework and therefore also carry meaning and information. And then we can feed this into this decision support tool that you just saw. But the most important thing is to do this in a co-creative manner, to do this together with stakeholders and potentially the end users, those that will actually be using these kind of tools, because that's the only way in which you could build trust and trust in the usage of this and have them being impactful. I have a couple of extra slides, but I don't think that is really needed unless you're like burning to see some of the more nuts and bolts of how we can use our models to go to biodiversity indicators and prioritization. So I think I might just stop there, and then if you're interested, we can elaborate more on that. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Martin, I think we do have time for one question from the audience. For Martin. Please, guys.
Thank you very much, Martin. It was a nice compilation of the longer version, a nice new take on it.
Thanks.
I was wondering this transition from the model-based to the co-creation, because there's a translation problem, I think, because of a lot of people you want to involve in co-creation might not be familiar with your modeling efforts. How do you tackle that?
Yeah, so the key is to have stakeholder engagement at the forefront. Even before the project started, we reached out to potential the stakeholder, informing them on our intention and getting early feedback on that. And then even before we started developing these tools, we were informing them of what these tools are and what comes out of it. And I mean, they may be technical and so on, but most of the managers are, I mean, they can understand what comes out of it. So, and some of them may be interested in the nuts and bolts of what comes out, but mainly it is to do with, we had a long discussion, okay, what are useful indicators of biodiversity? Indicators that can solve your headache and in terms of advising your management. But we've had workshops and inviting stakeholders to ask these questions if they felt needed. But we haven't really had a lot of questions about the nuts and bolts. I think that's up for the scientific community, and that's where we need to ensure that there's scientific rigor, because it's actually it's quite easy in one way to throw in some data and get some model output, and you produce a beautiful map of an area, and that can sometimes be misleading because there can be a lot of hidden errors behind such maps. So a lot of our work in terms of the project, scientifically speaking, has been thoroughly validating, checking input data, validating output. So I think in the machine room, there's a lot of work that needs to be done.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I think we need to move on to next speaker.
So we have heard that words and definitions actually matter, and that's why it's also very nice to invite Bas to the stage, who will also really show that words matter when it comes to law and implementation. Thanks, Bas.
Good morning, everyone. Let me see how I can set this up with my giant laptop on which I have my notes. It's a bit of a challenge for me to come after these two excellent, very charismatic and inspiring speakers. Myself being a lawyer, my background is in law and governance, so this might be a little bit more boring than the previous presentations. As Igor already said, I'm based in Tromsø. I'm at UiT at the Norwegian Center for the Law of the Sea. And so I'll be approaching the theme of nature-based solutions from a law and governance perspective, offering some reflections on the role of the High Seas Treaty. As we like to call it, we call it the BBNJ agreement, so the agreement on the biodiversity beyond national jurisdiction, because it's not only about the high seas, but also about the deep seabed beyond national jurisdiction. Do I use this for the slides? Great. So before turning to nature-based solutions, I want to first quickly introduce the BBNJ agreement for those of you that are maybe a bit less familiar with it. I heard there was a really good panel, I think yesterday, on the agreement already. I'm sure you've all heard these statistics that the high seas cover 45% of the planet and 64% of the surface of the oceans. And with that in mind, as well as the 30 by 30 target that we've also heard about quite a lot already, the entrance into force of the BBNJ agreement is obviously a huge deal. That said, there's a lot of misconceptions about the agreement. One that I often hear in the media is that the BBNJ agreement itself establishes this objective of protecting 30% of the oceans by 2030. The BBNJ agreement doesn't mention this target anywhere. What it does do is it provides, or it lays down sort of an institutional and regulatory framework for states and international organizations within which these area-based management tools and marine protected areas, or MPAs, can be implemented in the high seas. But putting that into practice is a very complex task. The agreement itself is still very much taking shape. There's a lot of moving parts, and one of the important questions that we still have in relation to MPAs is who is actually going to establish them. Because the BBNJ agreement itself will have its own institutions, it's going to have its own Conference of the Parties, or a COP, but it's actually likely that the COP will not have the competence to actually regulate any activities on the high seas. Because there's existing organizations like the fisheries bodies or the International Maritime Organization that already have competence to regulate activities on the high seas. And the agreement provides that this competence cannot be undermined, which is a really important word in the agreement, and this effectively bars the COP from designating MPAs themselves. And I'll return to the question of how then these MPAs are going to be established. But first, let's look at how MPAs tie into nature-based solutions in the context of the High Seas Treaty. The complicated thing for me, as a lawyer working on nature-based solutions or NBS, is that they aren't really legal concepts per se. As Anna already said, they're more of a sort of conceptual and sort of governance framework, but they don't create any treaty obligations. They're not recognized in any international treaties at this moment. Brief repetition, but as was already said by Igor as well as by Anna, is that they operate as a sort of policy framework describing actions to protect, restore, or sustainably manage ecosystems, while also then addressing societal challenges and promoting human well-being alongside those biodiversity objectives. So it's this emphasis on societal challenges and human well-being that's the defining feature of nature-based solutions, and it's with reference to these characteristics that we can assess how they tie into the BBNJ agreement. The BBNJ agreement itself doesn't refer to nature-based solutions at all. It also doesn't mention societal challenges or human well-being. The relevance of the BBNJ agreement in relation to NBS, has already been kind of said, is that it really focuses on area-based management tools and marine protected areas, which can qualify as NBS. And MPAs especially, when designed to maintain ecosystem functioning, they can use healthy marine ecosystems as a means of addressing such societal challenges, for example by enhancing ecosystem resilience, restoring fish stocks, or supporting other ecosystem services. And in this sense, MPAs provide the governance mechanism through which MBS-type outcomes can be delivered in the high seas. So, going to get a little bit more technical, but I think it's interesting to look at some of the BBNJ agreement provisions that actually strengthen this link between MBS and MPAs. Sorry for all the acronyms. It's something that we do as lawyers. I hope you can still follow. So first, Article 7 of the agreement lays down sort of all the general principles that underpin the application of the treaty as a whole. And here we already find some NBS-type language. It calls for approaches that build on ecosystem on building ecosystem resilience to climate change and ocean acidification, and also explicitly refers to carbon cycling services. And this matters from an MBS perspective because climate change is treated as a core societal challenge, obviously. And by linking ecosystem integrity to climate regulation, the agreement frames ecosystem protection as response to a problem that affects human societies. Second, if we look at the part of the agreement on area-based management tools and marine protected areas, Article 17 provides the objective for that part of the agreement, and it moves beyond biodiversity conservation alone. It refers to restoring and maintaining ecosystem services to strengthen resilience to climate-related stressors, again connecting ecosystem management to climate impacts. And it also even more explicitly provides that MPAs should support food security and other socioeconomic objectives, including cultural values. Food security is, of course, one of the most frequently cited societal challenges in NBS frameworks, and its inclusion here provides a very strong textual bridge between ecosystem protection and human well-being. So taken together, while the BBNJ agreement doesn't adopt the language of nature-based solutions explicitly, its provisions address human well-being and societal challenges in different ways, and as such and can be considered an NBS-compatible framework. The question of whether MPAs will actually qualify as NBS, as Martin said, kind of comes down to the nuts and bolts of those specific tools. So with that in mind, I think we can look at the question of who is actually establishing those MPAs, and especially in the Arctic. Here we have a nice map of the high seas regions in the Arctic. So of course we have in the middle the Central Arctic Ocean as the biggest chunk of high seas. On the top in the Bering Sea there's the loophole. And then in the Barents Sea there is the so-called donut hole, and then the sort of banana-shaped area offshore the Norwegian coast. It's called the banana hole. These are actually technical terms that we use to refer to these areas. So there's quite some large high seas pockets in the Arctic. So, as I mentioned before, it's not likely that the BBNJ institutions, especially the COP itself, is going to directly establish MPAs. So the effectiveness of the agreement is therefore going to depend to a large extent on existing governance structures like regional and sectoral organizations that already have competence to regulate activities in the high seas. So in the Arctic context, this reliance on existing structures may actually be promising, The region has traditionally been characterized by high degree of cooperation and coordination. Of course, this must now be qualified by the current geopolitical tensions, as well as by the presence of very well-established and mature institutional frameworks, which could play an important role in translating the BBNJ framework into actual biodiversity outcomes. And one specifically important actor is the OSPAR Commission that I think many of you will have heard of, the Commission for the Protection and Preservation of the Northeast Atlantic Ocean, that also has a mandate in part of the Central Arctic Ocean. OSPAR has experience in establishing high seas MPAs, and it also has a specific task force working right now on establishing an MPA in the high seas in the Arctic, something they've tried before, which then didn't work out because it wasn't supported by Denmark and Norway, but now everybody seems to be on board. And there's, of course, the Arctic Council. Even though its legal mandate is limited, it has long promoted this idea of creating this pan-Arctic network of MPAs through its coordinating and scientific work. And OSPAR and the Arctic Council actually both recognize nature-based solutions. OSPAR has committed to developing a regional nature-based solutions strategy to be implemented by 2030. And the Arctic Council doesn't promote NBS systemically, but it does recognize the concept in various of its working groups, and it also features in the Danish chairship program that was launched last year. An interesting mechanism that I also quickly want to mention is the so-called collective arrangement between the OSPAR Commission and the Northeast Atlantic Fisheries Commission, which is aimed at coordinating conservation efforts between different sectoral and regional actors in the Northeast Atlantic and in the Arctic region, with a lot of different bodies participating sort of on an ad hoc basis. And this type of coordinating mechanism fits really well within the BBNJ framework, which among its core objectives has the promotion of coordination and cooperation in the context of high seas conservation. Ultimately, though, the high seas MPAs in the Arctic will need to be established most likely from a bottom-up fashion. So in that sense, the relatively strong scientific and policy cooperation that we already see or saw in the region, supported by very well-established institutional frameworks, creates a potentially enabling environment for establishing MPAs in the Arctic, including nature-based solutions. So just quickly, a couple of key takeaways. There seems to be some potential for meaningful synergies between the BBNJ agreement, existing regional sectoral governance structures in the Arctic, and the use of nature-based solutions. So while the BBNJ agreement itself doesn't refer to NBS, its framework is for ABMT's area-based management tools and marine protected areas is NBS compatible, and it can support the application of nature-based solutions in the Arctic. In a region that's undergoing extremely rapid climatic and environmental changes, nature-based solutions matter because they offer a way to strengthen ecosystem resilience and buffer climate impacts rather than just responding to them afterwards. And in that sense, the BBNJ agreement can play an important role in enabling nature-based solutions in the Arctic. And that's it. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. Bas, there is time for one question for Bas, unless we can wait to the panel debate, and then we can address Bas. Thank you very much, Bas. Thanks to Anna, Martin, and Bas for covering conceptual, scientific, and legal aspects of the problem.
Almost too much food for thought, I think, here. It's a very interesting, overdose of information here almost. And so this is also why I think it's very important to give this kind of session a very good grounding, and to ask Rolf Hurtvan from AMAP to step up on the stage and to remind us, as the question also says, we're talking about Arctic area-based management. So we are in the Arctic, we are not talking about high seas over the world. The Arctic has its reality and consequences. Thanks, Rolf.
Thanks, Igor. You really put the ambitions high, so I'll do my best to respond. Good morning, everyone. My name is Rolf Hurtvan. I'm the Executive Secretary of the Arctic Monitoring and Assessment Program, one of the working groups to the Arctic Council, though we were established before the Arctic Council, so already under the Arctic Environmental Protection Strategy. I was going to start by saying every morning, my principle is every morning brings you a gift, and this morning actually brought me two when I saw the Mentimeter section in the beginning because I saw there were so many of you being executives and managers, which means you have the same level of competence as I do, which, to put it mildly, is probably not very deep on the details. So I'm glad to be among my equals. And the second one was to realize I was going to be the last, so whatever complicated question you will ask me, I'll say, as the previous speaker said. So from there, let's go. Well, I'm actually going to go back here first. So what I'm going to do, I'll try to kind of widen the perspectives a bit, tell a bit about like why do we need to think about management in a new way in terms of what we call the triple planetary crisis, which is also a concept brought in by the UN environment. And maybe if not clearing up, at least make your perception of what you heard a bit more complicated. So I guess here we go. As I said, AMAP, we started up already before the Arctic Council, and our mandate focusing on assessing transit levels in contaminants as well as climate change in the Arctic, the pathways, and how they impact both ecosystems and people in the Arctic. And from that, bring forward science-based recommendations to policymakers to bring forward actions to reduce those threats. And so we've done in now 35 years. And I would say quite successfully. We are, when you saw the screen you discussed whether on the policy side or the science side, we are very much to the far right-hand side there, working quite closely together with international organizations like the UN Conventions on Pollution, for instance. And as some of you may know, some of the conventions are actually established due to Arctic data. I'll come back to that in a second. What I was going to do, maybe make it a bit easy for you now, but I don't have this Mentimeter thing, but for those of you who know what kind of special day it is tomorrow, raise your hand. And oh, that's good. And for those of you who realized it was your wedding anniversary, you can donate. You can donate a local sum to the local flower store over there for bouquet of roses. But I didn't ask you for the answer, but do anyone want to say out loud? Sami National Day. That's great. Good. So a very important concept is when you think about Arctic, it's kind of vast open landscape, but it's not. It is inhabited. According to where we set the borders, 4 million people live in the Arctic. A large part of them is identify them as part of an indigenous group. Tromsø is a very atypical part of the Arctic. What you see here is not what the Arctic is like. If you go to northern Russia or northern Canada, you will see that it is much more remote. It has much less accessibility to those services we take as granted, like health services, social services, and so on. However, most people in the Arctic live in larger settlements. But most of the settlements are less than 5,000 people. And also when it comes to the Arctic, 2/3 of the settlements are located in permafrost. So they're strongly affected by the climate change going on. And as I said, those people, and I should actually start by saying this. So, Mundian Datnoseret. I'm from this area. And my grandparents are Sami, and I'm Sami. And those were also the first one telling me about climate change. And that is kind of the principle we are working on as well. Indigenous peoples and local communities is an immense source of knowledge and wisdom, which we also need to draw into the way we work. So here you can see a map of all the languages in the Arctic, all the indigenous languages in the Arctic, I should say, and the diversity of it. And it represents a resource. Sami, for instance, have 250, 300 words for snow. And that, of course, tells a bit about, not only about the snow, but also how it affects reindeer and ecosystem. The reason why the Arctic is a good case of thinking about management in new ways is the way how it's affected by climate change. Most of you are aware of the figure on the left-hand side. It's also taken from our latest climate report. But what I find is even more interesting is the figure on the right-hand side, how we can see how since, particularly since 1980, we have moved from an Arctic where 1/3 of the year is above freezing, so what we call summer. So to now where we have half of the year almost being above freezing. And that makes tremendous changes to the ecosystems. Water in its solid form and water in its liquid form does make some differences, in particular when you try to cross the river on ice. Also, the Arctic is a very sensitive indicator for pollutants. Even though there are very few sources for pollutants in the Arctic, the weather patterns, the wind patterns and sea currents bring pollutants up to the Arctic. And all organisms in the Arctic, well, most organisms in the Arctic are like me, they have a strong affinity for fat. So, and a lot of those pollutants are fatty, stick to fatty tissue. So contaminants accumulate and biomagnify, including up to the levels of humans. So when we started our work on mercury, for instance, we measured the levels of mercury in blood samples of humans on Greenland, being 50 times as high as what we found in industrialized cities in Europe and US. And that was the key to bring that forward to the UN, and that led to the establishment of the Minamata Convention. And that was to a large degree established on Arctic data, brought forward to the UN through AMAP and Arctic Council, also us acting as kind of a science broker. Also, I see things are jumping by themselves. Also, as you know more than we do, I do, biodiversity is changing tremendously in the Arctic, particularly, like for instance, on seabirds, like ivory gull. This is a figure from CAF. There's been a really serious decline. Also for other, like guillemots and so on, there's tremendous decline. And we often think that, well, birds or animals can just move. But if you bottom dwell on fish from the north shore of Svalbard on 50 meters and you have to move north, the bottom drops down to 2,700 meters, and that makes it not so pleasant, not such a pleasant place to be. So some of them are on the very edge of where they can live. So all of these three processes are covered by different conventions, like UNFCCC on climate, Stockholm Minamata Convention, for instance, on pollutants, IPBES, and Biodiversity Convention covers biodiversity. But the world is not that simple. It doesn't live in silos. So, for instance, when it comes to climate, this is a figure from the work we do together with CAF. We also have to take into consideration when it comes to climate, it's not only the climate affecting the ecosystem, but we also have feedback loops by increased or decreased CO2 intake, increased or decreased albedo and reflection of energy back to the atmosphere. And also that includes the potential of what we call ecosystem-based adaptation or nature-based solutions. But to do that, you also need to be aware that it has to be done in alignment and in cooperation with the Arctic communities. Also, even though, for instance, Stockholm Convention have been tremendously successful reducing level of contaminants to a large degree, we now see the curve flattening out and for some compounds even increasing. And that is due to partly due to climate change, or it's mainly due to climate change we see, where, for instance, pollutants deposited on glaciers are now remobilized and brought into the ecosystems and food webs again. There's greater flux between sea and air, and which again increase the uptake in the marine food webs. And also, like for instance, permafrost thaw releases mercury and methylmercury stored in ground into the rivers and then into the sea. So we do face a renewed threat which we need to counteract in other ways. So this just shows, particularly on the right-hand side, you see the level of the effects when it comes to mercury, where several species now have increased levels of mercury due to climate warming. So, to sum up, the polar bear do not care about formalities, which convention thinks different processes lays under. For them, it's the multi-stressor effect that is important. Contaminants, for instance, some of them do have an immunosuppressive effects, which means that when you have new species, new vectors for diseases, you may be more susceptible to some of the diseases, and you will have novel threats to those animals. Yeah. So, and the conventions they're not created to deal with these threats. For instance, Stockholm Convention, there was, when it was established, multi-stress effects were brought up for discussion, but they never made it into the convention. But we are looking in ways of trying to do so now. Yeah, I was asked by Igor just to say a bit, how do we work to make sure, or how do we work in science policy interface? For us, the key thing, I would say, is this box. Science policy processes is not a one-way process. It's a dialogue between policymakers and scientists. We bring them together, try to identify the policy-relevant questions, the policy-relevant scientific questions, including knowledge, indigenous knowledge, and then have a more targeted approach. And we line up with international bodies like the Stockholm Convention, Minamata Convention. Right now, we're running we're taking part in the effectiveness evaluation for the Minamata Convention to make sure that we feed the data in the right timeline and to the right processes in a targeted way. Yeah. A lot of what I refer to is available on the 2 reports you see here. By that, I'll just say thanks.
Thank you very much, Rolf. We have time for one question before we gather the panel on stage for the final debate. So if there is one question for Rolf, we take it now. Otherwise, we wait until Rolf joins the panel and we can start the panel discussion.
The question on the flower store, you can come to me afterwards. I can point you to it, because I usually forget as well.
Well, I'm going to be super rude and be mindful of time, because we are going to have a very short panel debate, as it looks like. We had very perfect different perspectives on this, so I asked the speakers to come to the stage, actually. I think we have... Yeah. So as you can see, or not see, because it's a digital notebook, I have too many questions that could be discussed here. I think in the time that we have, I think the most interesting question for me is, if I can be very selfish here, is just to further build on what we just saw perfectly outlined by Rolf. We are in the Arctic, and the Arctic is a special place. It's not the same in other places of the world. The Arctic is a place where we have multiple stressors at the same time. We have the triple planetary crisis. Some of that is going even faster in the Arctic. At the same, for example, climate change is going the fastest in the Arctic, for example. So in the perspective of a region which is not very small, but is a quite large region, where we have several stressors at the same time, some of them going very fast, especially on a global level. We're talking about an area which is both high seas as well as very coastal. And very coastal means, and I very like that we got reminded of that, the Arctic is a place of Arctic peoples. So, and that's why I really liked, and I'm just going to continue on this, what you said, Rolf, that it's not bad to think about new ways of how we're doing management in the Arctic, and this is why I thought this would be a very interesting side event. And so the very simple from my side, but maybe for you quite challenging. Given all the information that we have seen and that you know of, is there something from nature-based solutions, something from that framework, from that philosophy, that you could see could improve Arctic-based management in the Arctic? Either a positive thing, or if you also wanted to go on the other side, is there a problem? Could there be a problem, or both? So, and I think we start with ladies first. I'm sorry.
Yeah, I think, like I said, I'm not very diplomatic, so I struggle with this, and then I regret what I say. So don't hold me to this, or
totally fine.
But I really struggle sometimes when we use concepts without thinking about why, and that is what I think I was trying to flag: is that we've already know so many of the challenges around implementation of different management measures. So I'm not saying that nature-based solutions can't be a really good tool or a way of rethinking and reframing how we do things. I think that kind of potentially slightly more academic exercise or practical exercise is really valuable. But I think, as I said at the end of my talk, we know that actually a lot of the challenges here are around process, or around inclusion, or around, and does nature-based solutions address that? And I think I'm not yet enough of an expert to know, but I think that's where I'd really maybe would want to focus more. It's like, does reframing help, or is actually, do we just need to think about process, and are there actually tools to help us do that? And if nature-based solutions can do that, then great. But I think that would be my "it depends" answer.
Well, I do share your vision and the need for better terminology and clearer definitions and clearer criteria for how we use these terms. And then coming back to the requirements noted by some of my colleagues, that we need clearer objectives, we need policy alignment, and we need an environmental context and the use of material. And I think there is definitely a place for NBS to play out in the Arctic, and I think among the passive versus the active NBS, so talking about marine protected areas versus restoration, I think that primarily we were going to see passive activities such as MPAs being also put forward in the Arctic, because simply there's a need to fulfill the 30 by 30. And also now to cover the high seas. And I think in terms of the more active restorations, that may be something yet to come into the future if we see that the Arctic and its environment and the coast will be exploited to a larger degree. Currently, there are not many habitats that are being completely destroyed as we have on more southern latitudes, where most of our coastlines are exploited. But there might be room for more active restoration in that respect, but I don't see that as being the primary use of NBS at the moment. But it's good to bear in mind in that kind of toolbox, because there's also the legal framework of the nature restoration law, which is legally binding. I don't know if it actually mentions NBS, but since it mentions restoration, NBS is the tool to achieve restoration. So we may be seeing that more on our doorstep in the years to come.
I'm not going to answer your question, but no, it's more like on how we can do this. And I'm now drawing some of the principles we have when it comes to, under what we call the Sustainable Arctic Observatory Network, or SEON. And that's like usually when we try to define these things, and I mean, listening to the presentations and so on, we haven't really defined what we are looking for and what we're going to do. But the principle we have, usually as researchers, and I'm a researcher as well, we think about what are we going to do and why do we want to do that. That's our two first questions. But in saying also, we try, maybe we should turn it a bit around and let's the first question be like, who are we going to talk with to understand this? And then define, say first who, and then why, also the why for them. And then the solution may be better. And there's a lot of good examples of nature-based solutions. There are also a lot of examples of nature-based solutions implied that may not work very well, and it creates actually more conflict and also disrespect for the solution. So we have to be careful also, or we have to think carefully about how we're going to implement them before we actually start doing so.
Yeah, one thing I was thinking about when you were talking about, how rapid change in the Arctic and climate change, and I think there lies an opportunity in nature-based solutions in the fact that, we've talked today about how it's kind of an ambiguous concept, and we've had all these really long definitions with all these different components. But I think that could also be the strength of nature-based solutions, is that they are sort of a very broad, flexible tool that also invites you to think differently about conservation, restoration, area-based management. And one thing we're looking into in Resolve as well, and that I wanted to talk about today, but I decided not to because of time constraints, is thinking differently about area-based management. And we have seen so many different maps where you use, we write little lines to delineate different areas where we do different things. But of course, everything in the Arctic, especially with climate change, is changing. It's moving. We have discussed all these species migrations, and so it's also an opportunity to maybe think about managing things more dynamically, thinking different about space. And I think it offers an opportunity to sort of rethink how we govern and protect areas. I think that's also a potential strength.
I'm doing a terrible job putting the answers together because they're just perfect in the way that I was hoping you would answer from your perspectives. I was interrupting you, Rolf. Please go.
I was just saying that's a really good point, because that's a big weakness. That's a great weakness of the conventions we see. They're too static. They just like Stockholm Convention. It's really hard to nominate new candidates to be regulated. So to adopt a more dynamic way of thinking about management is so important, and it's really what you need now, given the change, the speed of the change, and how I say it's not one area, it's not one process, it's so much more.
So the other question that was really on my mind when I was really exposed to this concept for the first time, it looks quite holistic, actually. So just as I tried to say in my opening slides, it looks like it's trying to answer many things at the same time, because it's trying to think about a holistic way of looking about nature and humans more together. Maybe that's a misconception from my side. And so this is why I thought, well, we are in the Arctic and we have Western science of the way how we give advice to management. And we also have indigenous knowledge, which also gives or should give advice to management. But these are two very different ways of looking at the world, where indigenous people look very holistically at their homes and are place-based, are part of the ecosystem, while it looks like in the Western science way we're trying to get there. Do you think this nature-based solutions framework is maybe one of those ways we could get closer to indigenous worldview perspective, or would it actually come with caveats or dangers when we try to do that?
I'm going to be really blunt and say no, and I think there's a danger of harm with that as well, because I think fundamentally nature-based solutions requires on separating people and nature again, and we've seen some fantastic talks on like more holistic approaches, different ways of thinking about relational approaches as well. And so again, being a non-expert in nature-based solutions, but my background is in ecosystem services, and I think there is a harm if we keep using concepts that continue to dichotomize.
Absolutely.
And so I think actually the challenge there more is like, maybe we can embed relationality within nature-based solutions, and maybe that's being done, and then great. But I think on a very surface level, that's what my gut feeling would say, and that we have just a danger of continuing to perpetuate that really dualistic perspective.
Do you think we have a way to get there, for example, Martin?
Well, I would perhaps have a bit of a more optimistic outlook on this, because I think that nature-based solutions and when we protected areas and these different measures or management actions are embedded within the ecosystem approach to management. They should, at least. And the ecosystem-based approach to management should invite all voices as part of an initial scoping phase and have that dialogue being on the table forefront. So if done in a correct manner, that dialogue is established, and then these tools, including then nature-based solutions, should be made in such a way that they serve dual purpose and they respect those views. If misused, then that will be the outcome. But I think that the framework and the context invites a positive outcome of this, if done properly.
Okay.
Maybe you want to.
Can I? No, I just want to quickly, because actually I don't want to see this as negative, but I almost want to say, be bold. It's like, is this actually beneficial? And as I say, I referred to the session on co-creation yesterday that showed some really fantastic, like how we integrate different worldviews and different knowledge types. So I think the Arctic, from its history of like much closer collaboration and integration, can actually probably, I hate to say lead the, I don't like those big statements, but it could just design something that's for the Arctic in the Arctic that isn't necessarily drawing on nature-based solutions. So I think if that's a provocation, I would actually see it as more optimistic rather than trying to poo-poo all these different concepts.
What do you think, Rolf, from your gut feeling? Because you're being exposed to a lot of new information here, I'm sure. We talk about ecosystem-based management in the Arctic, so how do you feel about this?
They covered it very well. It all depends on how you do it, how do you approach it, and at what stage to bring in the local communities and indigenous communities, and the earlier the better.
Yeah. And from a legal aspect, what do you think best? Does it make sense to try to do that? Is there room for improvement in ongoing legal frameworks?
I would underscore what's been said already. It's a difficult thing to comment on as sort of a lawyer. you see in, we've talked about the BBNJ agreement, the High Seas Treaty, and we have, this global biodiversity framework with the 30 by 30 threshold, and there's, more and more references to indigenous knowledge involving indigenous communities in these processes. And, the thing is, it's really easy, or like comparatively easy, to put these things in a treaty or in a policy document, but actually, translating that into sort of on-the-ground involvement, I think that's what everybody's been saying. That's where the crux lies, and I think, that's beyond my sort of vision as a lawyer, but I think that's what's the most important thing.
That's why we're working together.
Exactly.
Okay, thank you so much. At the same time, we have a huge crowd on the other side of my right side, so I also want to open up the floor if there are some questions that you would like to pose in this setting here, to give the space for that. We are exactly at 10:30, so I can also understand if people need to move out of the room. But
okay, my name is Elvar Halfredsson. I work at IMR here in Norway, but I'm mostly in fisheries assessment. I've been in for several years, so I'm not an expert of this field, but I'm on the side of it. But I just sit here and I'm thinking, in the fisheries assessment thing, we have this concept, one more acronym, MSY. Maximum sustainable yield. It includes also maximum. So I'm just wondering, and also Arctic, okay, high Arctic, and it's important with indigenous people, and we've been hearing about small-scale fisheries. But in the Barents Sea and Iceland and Barents Sea, it's not about small scale altogether. Even when I was growing up in a small village in Iceland, there were like 5 fishermen in a small boat. In a similar sized boat now, one person is fishing much more. So it's about revenue, money, and so on. So I'm just wondering, optimizing utilization, optimizing exploitation, is that also a part of a nature-based solution? Maybe controversial, but...
someone feels bold enough?
Well, I guess the question, it's within the framework of ecosystem-based management, if done properly. So MSY, of course, is a question concept, but if one could be thinking about it in a more of a holistic approach, so then that should be sort of contrasted with other objectives around. And then, of course, what is the role of nature-based solutions in that respect? I mean, then we have a lot of area-based management tools that can, to some degree, regulate fishing activities to try to increase the stock size or the status to arrive to MSY. So I don't know to what extent the NBS as such can really tackle that particular aspect, but by restricting fisheries, for sure, that will have a direct impact on fishing opportunities and hopefully also improving the long-term sustainability of the fish stocks. Yeah, that's my take on it.
Thanks, Martin. I realize we're a bit over time, and if the audience still is up for it, if you still have this open, the Mentimeter, I think it would be very nice to conclude with just one last vote and see what the side event actually has brought to you. Confusion or clarity, or both. Keep pulling. Well, it's interesting to see that no one is super negative about it. Also, no one super positive, and I think we.
You can ask if people are still confused.
Yeah, I think that's my conclusion of this. It's a complex issue, and people are confused. Thank you so much to the panel, and thank you so much for showing up. Have a nice day.